Now, farmers in the Free State are urged to take extra precautions in light of an African armyworm outbreak in the province. The Department of Agriculture, Rural Development and Environmental Affairs has confirmed that the infestation has spread towards Boshof, with 31 cases reported in the last 2 days. The root cause of the outbreak is unknown. African armyworms cover large areas of grass, pasture, or very small maize and sorghum in dense swarms of worms. Free State Agriculture Commercial Manager Jack Armour joins us to discuss this. A very good evening to you, Jack. Thank you for your time. How does one assess the impact and the scale of this outbreak?
Good evening. Yes, thank you for the opportunity. I don't know if we are assessing the scale yet at the moment, or the impact. The scale is quite wide. The armyworm infestation is quite big. Big areas, the whole southern western Free State, all the way up to Douglas. These armyworms, you said the source and the origin is unknown. Apparently it's moths that hatched out in Central Africa somewhere that have blown down here. And then in February they hatched in the northern parts of the country. And then they went through a full cycle, made moths again, worms, moths, pupae, larvae. And then the eggs hatched in moths and they blew and they hatched here in the Free State now again. So large swarms have been swarming here. And the biggest damage is to planted pastures, teff, sorghum, and what was the other one? Grasses, grass pastures. The veld is not so badly affected, and then crops. The pesticides that farmers normally spray on their crops can be used for the worms. So the crops aren't a big problem, and the actual natural pasture is not such a big problem. The biggest problem is actually the planted grazing, in terms of grasses and teffs and sorghum and things like that.
What does it mean for farmers? I mean, how does this affect their end product?
The animals that are grazing on the pastures and the planted pastures where the worms are, that's the problem. The grasses give off a toxin, a kind of cyanide, when they start getting grazed by these worms. And that cyanide can stay in that grass for up to 40 days. So the livestock that's grazing on that pasture for 40 days builds up this high cyanide level in their meat, and then they start staggering and sliming and stuff, and one's got to call out a vet, otherwise those livestock can die.
You made mention of the root cause being related to moths that were blown down to the Free State. How much knowledge and know-how is there around the life cycle of the armyworm, and perhaps ways to tackle it?
So there's two types of armyworm. You get the fall armyworm, and that's the notifiable one that, according to the Pest Control Act, that government needs to actually take action on. The African armyworm is actually an indigenous species. So there's no responsibility for government to have to take precautions to prevent its spread. But we're very grateful that government has stepped in and has provided blowers and sprayers and stuff. So the locust control teams on the ground that are on standby have stepped up. So the two types of armyworm, the fall armyworm is the dangerous one that also comes from Africa, and also the African armyworm, and they have a long-term cycle. So there's quite a lot of knowledge and a lot of research that's been done on them. But according to Dr. Gerrit Verduen of CropLife Africa, in the last 40 years that he's been involved with these type of pests, this has been the biggest outbreak of African armyworm that he's seen in Southern Africa.
What will happen if it's not contained? I mean, we're learning here that it's spreading towards Boshof, and there's 31 cases which have been reported in the last 2 days.
Luckily, these are subtropical moths and worms and eggs and larvae. And as soon as we get a frost in the Free State, it's going to wipe them out. So they're not going to survive. So the next outbreak would have to come from up north again. So the longer term, the next couple of weeks until there's frost, they're going to be around, but it can be sprayed. They can be contained, and luckily the veld is still growing quite well, and they're not eating as much veld as what the fall armyworm would have been eating. So it is a cause of concern, but it's not a major disaster, not a major crisis that that our food security is in jeopardy.
Yeah.
But it can be a disaster for individual farmers that can lose a lot of their crop, a lot of livestock, a lot of their grazing.
So what signs should farmers be on the lookout for? Should they, want to be a few steps ahead of these worms?
To be ahead and to use the advice of Dr. Gerard Verdoorn is in the evenings, just after sunset, to go and have a look outside if there's moths swarming. So usually the first sign before the eggs are laid is the moths swarming. And the eggs, I think, only sit in the soil for 2 days until they hatch into small little worms. So if you can notice the moths, you've got a 2-3 day period to get enough poison that when the larvae hatch, the eggs hatch, that you can start spraying those little larvae.
Very well. Thank you so much for speaking to us this evening.